This is where we hold them! This is where we fight!
Most people think ancient warriors lived like heroes in epic tales, sleeping on comfortable beds and eating hearty meals between glorious battles. But the truth is, they didn't. At least not in Sparta. Spartan boys were ripped from their families at age 7 and thrown into military barracks that would make a dungeon look like luxury accommodation. They slept on beds made of reeds they gathered themselves, ate disgusting black broth that made grown men vomit, and survived training so brutal it killed weaker children. Spartan camps focused on survival and discipline, shaping boys into the most feared warriors of the ancient world. Boys who entered the Agoge system either emerged as unstoppable killing machines or didn't emerge at all. Other Greeks called the Spartan training system inhuman and even barbaric. They were right to be terrified, because Spartan barracks had broken every rule about how children were supposed to be raised and created warriors who could conquer entire armies. They lived like prisoners, trained like gladiators, and fought like demons. While boys everywhere else learned reading and played with toys, Spartan children learned to endure pain, steal food to survive, and kill without hesitation. And this was all about creating a military machine so effective it terrorized the entire ancient world. So, today we're stepping into ancient Spartan barracks to see exactly how these boys survived conditions that would break grown men. It starts with how they were torn from their mothers, and it gets more shocking from there. While other Greek boys played with wooden toys and learned their letters, 7-year-old Spartan males were examined like livestock and dragged away from everything they'd ever known. The state inspectors didn't ask for permission. They didn't care about tears or protests. If a boy was deemed physically acceptable, he belonged to Sparta now, and his childhood was officially over. The barracks were stone dormitories that housed dozens of boys in conditions that would horrify anyone concerned with child welfare. No privacy, no comfort, no mercy. Just rows of hard sleeping surfaces, and the constant smell of unwashed bodies, fear, and something that might generously be called food. The first night was designed to break them. Boys who had never been away from their mothers were suddenly surrounded by strangers, sleeping on surfaces harder than the ground, with no one to comfort them when they cried. The older boys made it clear that weakness would be punished, crying would be mocked, and homesickness was a luxury they couldn't afford. Many boys didn't survive the first year. Historical accounts mention that some simply couldn't adapt to the harsh conditions and died from illness or training accidents. The Spartans viewed this as natural selection. Only the strongest would become warriors worthy of their reputation. Forget any notion of comfortable sleeping arrangements. Spartan boys slept on what the Greeks called pallets, essentially piles of reeds and rushes they had to gather themselves from the riverbanks. These were glorified piles of dried grass that provided about as much comfort as sleeping on a pile of kindling. The boys had to replace their reed bedding regularly. But here's the cruel twist. They could only gather reeds with their bare hands. No tools, just young fingers trying to break tough river reeds that would slice their hands bloody. The Spartans believed this would toughen their skin and teach them to endure pain without complaint. Winter made the sleeping situation even more brutal. The barracks had no heating, and those reed beds provided virtually no insulation from the cold stone floors. Boys would huddle together for warmth, but the older warriors who supervised them would often separate groups they thought were getting too comfortable. Comfort was weakness, and weakness was death. The bedding was rarely replaced completely. Fresh reeds would be added on top, but underneath lay weeks or months of accumulated filth, insects, and whatever else had found its way into the sleeping areas. Boys would wake up covered in bites from various creatures that called their beds home, but complaining about it would earn them extra training or reduced food rations. If the sleeping arrangements were bad, the food was worse. The centerpiece of Spartan military nutrition was something called black broth, a concoction so revolting that foreign visitors would literally vomit after tasting it. The recipe included pig's blood, vinegar, and salt, boiled together into what one historian described as liquid that looked like it came from the underworld. The boys had to be grateful for it. Complaining about food was forbidden, and showing disgust while eating would result in punishment. They learned to consume anything put in front of them without expression, no matter how revolting it tasted or smelled. Food portions were deliberately insufficient. The boys were kept hungry as part of their training, forced to supplement their meager rations through theft and foraging. But if you got caught stealing food, then good luck. You might be punished severely, not because stealing was wrong, but because getting caught showed incompetence. Successful theft was actually encouraged. The physical training in Spartan barracks was controlled violence, designed to weed out anyone who couldn't handle warfare. Boys were beaten regularly, not as punishment, but as conditioning. They learned to take hits without crying, to fight back when attacked, and to keep going even when their bodies wanted to quit. Combat training started with wooden weapons and progressed to real bronze spears and swords as the boys proved they could handle them without accidentally killing each other. Too often, injuries were common, deaths were not unusual, and medical care was minimal. Boys who couldn't recover from training injuries quickly were often dismissed from the program entirely. Boys even learned to endure psychological torture as well. They were humiliated, terrorized, and broken down mentally before being built back up as warriors. The process destroyed their individual personalities and replaced them with the collective identity of Spartan soldiers. Older boys were encouraged to torment younger ones as part of the training process. This created a hierarchy of suffering, where survival meant either enduring abuse or becoming strong enough to dish it out. The barracks became a pressure cooker of violence, where only the most resilient personalities could maintain their sanity. Life in the barracks operated on a brutal hierarchy where age meant power, and power meant survival. The oldest boys had absolute authority over younger ones, and they used this authority to create their own twisted kingdom within the military system. Older boys could demand food, clothing, or services from younger ones, and refusal was met with violence. Boys who showed exceptional skills could rise in the ranks regardless of their age, while those who showed weakness would find themselves at the bottom of the social order, no matter how long they'd been in the system. The supervisors encouraged this internal competition because it mimicked the realities of military command. Future Spartan officers needed to learn how to command respect, maintain discipline, and make life or death decisions about the men under their command. The barracks hierarchy was training for the chain of command they would use in actual warfare. Those who couldn't adapt to the hierarchy often didn't survive. Boys who were consistently victimized would sometimes die from their injuries, commit suicide, or simply waste away from the stress. Despite the brutality, or perhaps because of it, the boys who survived the barrack system formed bonds stronger than family. They had shared experiences that no one else could understand, survived horrors that would break most people, and depended on each other for survival in ways that created unbreakable loyalty. These bonds became the foundation of Spartan military effectiveness. When Spartan warriors fought together, they were protecting the brothers who had suffered alongside them, who had shared their food when they were starving, who had covered for them when they were caught stealing, who had helped them survive when survival seemed impossible. The brotherhood extended beyond friendship into absolute trust. Spartan warriors knew that the man fighting beside them had already proven his courage, endurance, and loyalty under the worst possible conditions. There was no question about whether he would hold the line, follow orders, or sacrifice himself for the group. The barracks had already tested him beyond breaking. This trust created a military unit that fought with unprecedented coordination and fearlessness. Other armies were collections of individual soldiers trying to stay alive. Spartan armies were unified organisms where each warrior was willing to die rather than let down his brothers. The Agorg system worked exactly as designed. It created the most feared military force in ancient Greece and produced warriors whose reputation for courage and skill lasted for centuries. But the cost was enormous in human terms. Most boys who entered the system didn't survive to become full Spartan citizens. Those who did survive were often psychologically damaged in ways that affected the rest of their lives. The brutality they endured and inflicted shaped their personalities, their relationships, and their ability to function in peacetime. Many Spartan warriors struggled with civilian life because they had been trained for nothing but warfare. The system also created a society that was ultimately unsustainable. The constant focus on military excellence came at the expense of everything else. Sparta never developed the arts, philosophy, or economic innovations that other Greek cities used to build lasting civilizations. But for the boys who lived through those hellish barracks, survival itself was a victory. They had endured conditions that would destroy most people and emerged as the most respected warriors in the ancient world. They had paid the ultimate price for strength, and they had earned the fear and respect of everyone who knew what they had survived. But the most horrifying aspect of Barracks life was reserved for the elite few who showed exceptional promise. The most promising trainees were selected for something called the Cryptia, a secret police force that operated with complete impunity. This was state-sanctioned terrorism designed to keep the helot slave population in check while completing the psychological transformation of Spartan warriors. Every autumn, the Spartan government would formally declare war on their helot slaves, allowing members of the Crypteia to kill and terrorize them without any legal consequences. The boys selected for this program were given a simple mission: hunt humans like animals, strike fear into the slave population, and prove they could kill without hesitation or remorse. The Crypteia operatives would be sent out with minimal supplies, forced to live off the land and whatever they could steal or take by force. They would move through helot communities at night, identifying potential troublemakers, gathering intelligence, and occasionally murdering slaves who showed signs of leadership or rebellion. The psychological impact on the boys who participated was enormous. They learned that human life had no value outside of Spartan citizenship, that violence was not just acceptable but praiseworthy when it served state interests, and that they were above any moral law that might restrain ordinary people. The Crypteia not only created warriors, but even created sociopaths with military training. The entire barrack system depended on something most people don't understand about Sparta. It was essentially a military occupation force ruling over a massive slave population. The Helots were conquered peoples from the Messenian Wars who had been enslaved by Sparta and forced to work the land. These slaves outnumbered Spartan citizens by at least 7-1, creating a constant threat of rebellion that required constant vigilance. This demographic reality shaped everything about Barracks life. The boys were being prepared to suppress domestic uprisings, control a hostile population, and maintain a system of oppression that depended entirely on fear and violence. The brutality of their training reflected the brutality required to keep their society functioning. Unlike traditional slaves, helots were allowed to accumulate some wealth and maintain family structures, which made them even more dangerous to Spartan control. Wealthy, organized helots with family ties were exactly the kind of people who might organize rebellions. The barrack system produced warriors specifically designed to identify and eliminate these threats. The boys learned to view helots not as human beings, but as dangerous animals that required constant management. They were taught that showing mercy to helots was showing weakness to enemies, and that any helot who displayed intelligence, leadership, or prosperity was automatically a threat to Spartan security. At age 12, the physical conditioning became even more extreme when boys were deprived of all clothing except a single red cloak and forced to sleep outside year-round. This permanent exposure to the elements was designed to condition their bodies to function in any environment without shelter or protection. The cloak was a symbol of their transformation from individual children into components of the Spartan military machine. The red color served a practical purpose. It disguised bloodstains during combat training and actual fighting. Boys learned early that they would be bleeding regularly, and their clothing was designed to hide the evidence. Archaeological evidence from ancient Sparta shows that Adult Spartan males had bone density and muscle attachment points that exceeded anything seen in other Greek populations. Perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of Barracks' life was the complete isolation from normal human relationships. The goal was the transformation of boys into soldiers whose loyalty was to the state and their brothers in arms, not their families. This required severing every emotional connection that might compete with military loyalty. Boys were forbidden from maintaining relationships with their parents, siblings, or anyone outside the barrack system. Contact with family was strictly limited and carefully supervised. This isolation extended to romantic relationships as well. Boys were encouraged to form intense emotional bonds with their military partners, but these relationships were carefully managed to reinforce rather than compete with military loyalty. Love and affection were redirected away from family and toward the military unit. This emotional reconstruction created warriors who were literally incapable of normal civilian life. They had been conditioned to find meaning only in military service, satisfaction only in violence, and identity only in their role as Spartan soldiers. Peace was not rest for these men. It was psychological torture. While other Greek cities focused purely on military skills, Spartan barracks included sophisticated intelligence training that created warriors who were as dangerous with information as they were with weapons. Boys learned to gather intelligence, analyze enemy weaknesses, and conduct psychological warfare operations that could destabilize entire cities. The intelligence training started with observation exercises where boys would be required to memorize complex details about people, places, and activities, then report their findings with perfect accuracy. Mistakes in observation led to severe punishment because intelligence failures in real operations could mean the death of entire military units. They learned to adopt disguises, speak different dialects, and blend into foreign populations. Some boys became so skilled at infiltration that they could pass as natives in enemy cities, gathering intelligence for months or years before revealing their true identities. The most horrifying truth about the Agug system was its casualty rate. Modern historians estimate that the system turned childhood into what would today be recognized as a traumatic experience, but the actual human cost was far higher than most people realize. The majority of boys who entered the system never emerged as full Spartan citizens. Some died from the physical rigors of training, others were killed during combat exercises or criminal activities they were forced to undertake. Many more were dismissed from the program for failing to meet the impossible standards required for graduation. These failures weren't sent home to their families. They became second class citizens with no political rights and limited economic opportunities. The boys who did survive were often psychologically destroyed in ways that affected every aspect of their lives. They struggled with the relationships, couldn't adapt to peacetime activities, and frequently died young from the cumulative effects of childhood trauma and physical abuse. The system created perfect warriors by destroying perfectly good human beings. But perhaps most disturbing was how the system perpetuated itself. The men who survived the Agog became the instructors for the next generation, passing on the trauma, brutality, and psychological damage to new groups of children. Each generation became more extreme than the last, as instructors tried to match or exceed their own horrific experiences. The legendary lawgiver Lycurgus introduced the Agoj system in the 7th century BC with the goal of transforming Spartan society to build its formidable military might. The system worked exactly as designed for over 3 centuries, creating warriors whose reputation for courage and effectiveness became legendary throughout the ancient world. But the ultimate irony is that the system which made Sparta dominant also guaranteed its eventual decline. The Agog produced the finest hoplites in the Greek world, capable of fighting in the phalanx formation that both awed and struck fear in their contemporaries. But it also created a society that couldn't adapt to changing military technologies or political realities. The boys who survived those hellish barracks became men who could only function in the specific type of warfare for which they had been trained. When military tactics evolved beyond the phalanx formation, and when economic competition became more important than military conquest, Sparta found itself with a military force that was perfectly adapted to a world that no longer existed. The mystery is how human beings could design a system so brutal and effective that it created legends that still inspire awe thousands of years later. The Spartan barracks were furnaces that burned away everything weak and left only the strongest steel behind. But in the end, the very steel that made Sparta invincible became its downfall. Too rigid to bend, it broke when the world demanded something more.